September 3rd, 1944. Somewhere outside Aachen, Germany. The rumble comes first. Not artillery, not the sharp, tearing crack Weiss learned to fear, but something deeper, heavier. A continuous mechanical thunder that rolls across the ground like an approaching storm. Hauptmann Erich Müller presses himself tighter against the crater wall, helmet pulled low, field glasses clutched uselessly in his left hand. The earth vibrates beneath his boots. Dust shakes loose from the shattered stone around him. "Tanks," someone mutters behind him. Müller already knows. Through the smoke, dark shapes emerge. Low silhouettes, broad hulls, turrets moving with slow, deliberate confidence. Not one or two, but dozens, advancing in loose formation, infantry hugging their side. American M4 Sherman tanks. They keep coming. Müller counts automatically, a habit drilled into him since Poland. 1, 2, 3. He reaches 10 and forces himself to stop. There are too many. More than his depleted company has anti-tank rounds to handle. More than his radio can summon artillery for. More than Germany can afford to lose men against. The order comes late. Rückzug, fall back. They do. Not in panic, but in resignation. By the time Müller reaches the rear, his hands are shaking. Not from fear, but from the same thought gnawing at every surviving German officer in the West. Where are they getting all of this? 2 days later, Müller is captured. The surrender is brief, professional. An American lieutenant takes his pistol, nods once, and motions him toward a waiting truck. There is no shouting, no triumph, just paperwork and movement, always movement. Müller expects a cage, maybe a temporary field camp. Instead, after processing and weeks of transport, he finds himself on a ship, crossing the Atlantic under guard, staring at a horizon that feels impossibly wide. America. He has heard of it, of course, studied it, dismissed it in staff briefings as soft, slow to mobilize, incapable of true sacrifice. A nation of factories that would take years to matter. By November 1944, Müller knows that briefing was wrong. The tour is presented as routine. A small group of captured German officers, armored, logistics, staff, are escorted by U.S. Army officers through an industrial complex in the American Midwest. The building stretches farther than Müller can see. Overhead cranes glide smoothly along rails. Assembly lines move with quiet precision. The air smells of oil, hot steel, and electricity. No one rushes. No one improvises. They stop at a railing overlooking the factory floor. Below them, tanks move, not in combat, but in birth. Hulls glide forward on tracks. Turrets are lowered into place by cranes with practiced ease. Engines are installed, tested, removed, and replaced again without drama. An American major gestures casually. "This is one of several facilities producing Shermans," he says. "Output varies, but lately it's been steady." Müller leans forward despite himself. "How many?" he asks, voice tight. The major checks a clipboard, as if confirming a train schedule. "Across all plants? Several thousand a month." The words land harder than artillery. Several thousand. Müller feels his mouth go dry. He does the math instinctively. German armored divisions in the West are lucky to replace a handful of tanks in a month. Factories bombed, rail lines cut, steel rationed, skilled workers dead or drafted. Several thousand a month. Another officer beside Müller, a former Panzer Regiment commander, lets out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "That's impossible," he says quietly. "We barely build that many in a year." The American does not argue. He simply nods. They walk again. Past rows of finished tanks, painted olive drab. Serial numbers, stenciled cleanly. past rail cars waiting patiently on spur lines, ready to carry armor straight to ports. Past workers, men and women, focused, unhurried, efficient. No bomb damage, no patched roofs, no missing windows. Müller notices something else that unsettles him deeply. There is no urgency. This is not a nation straining at its limits. This is a system operating comfortably within them. At lunch, they sit in a clean canteen. Hot food, coffee without ration tokens. An American captain speaks openly, unaware he is delivering a death sentence to Müller's remaining illusions. These numbers will hold through 45, he says. Maybe increase. Müller stares down at his tray and finally understands what the Sherman columns in France really meant. They were not the spear point. They were the overflow. The realization does not come with anger. It comes with clarity. Germany is fighting a war of replacement. America is fighting a war of production. And production, Müller now sees, has already won. November 1944. American Midwest. The factory does not sleep. That is the first thing Hauptmann Erich Müller realizes as the tour continues. Shifts change without noise. Workers rotate smoothly, one line feeding the next. When a whistle blows, it signals transition, not exhaustion. Fresh crews step in while machines keep moving, their rhythm uninterrupted. Müller watches a Sherman hull glide forward on rollers. Sparks flash as welders seal seams with practiced precision. The work is fast, but not frantic. Gauges are checked, measurements confirmed. If something is wrong, the line pauses briefly, then resumes. In Germany, pauses mean delays measured in weeks. Here, pauses are measured in minutes. An American civilian supervisor explains the process without condescension, using the tone of a man describing a railroad timetable. Hulls arrive from one plant, turrets from another, engines from a third. Nothing is made here alone. Everything is part of a network. Bottlenecks get solved upstream, the supervisor says. If steel's late, another supplier steps in. Another supplier. Müller exchanges a glance with the panzer officer beside him. In the Reich, there are no alternatives anymore. When a plant is bombed, production simply stops. When a specialist dies, his skill dies with him. They pass a board listing daily output figures. Yesterday's numbers are crossed out neatly. Today's are already higher. How long did it take to build this system? Müller asks. The supervisor thinks for a moment. Depends when you start counting. Some of these plants existed before the war. We just expanded them. Expanded. Müller remembers German debates in 1941. Arguments over whether total mobilization would hurt civilian morale, whether women should be moved into factories, whether converting peacetime industry too quickly might damage quality. Here the debate ended years ago. The Americans did not ask if they should mobilize. They asked how fast. The group pauses near a test bay. A finished Sherman is run at full power. The engine roars. The tank lurches forward, brakes hard, then pivots smoothly. A technician checks a clipboard and waves it on. Müller notices how many tanks are rejected, and how calmly. If something fails inspection, it is rolled aside, corrected, returned. No speeches, no blame. No pressure to ship flawed machines, because replacements cannot be spared. They can be spared. That truth settles heavier with every step. On the walk back, an American officer mentions production losses casually. A derailment last month, a machinery breakdown. Müller waits for the consequences. Instead, the officer shrugs. Output dipped for a few days. In Germany, such losses cripple regions for months. That evening, Müller sits in his barracks, unable to sleep. The sound of distant freight trains drifts through the window. Steady, confident, unbroken. Each horn blast marks another shipment moving on time. He pulls out a pencil and begins writing numbers on scrap paper. German tank losses, replacement rates, American monthly output, shipping capacity, training cycles. The figures do not argue. No tactical brilliance can erase this gap. No heroic counterattack can close it. The Americans do not need their tanks to be perfect. They need them to exist, in quantity, on schedule, endlessly. For the first time since donning a uniform, Müller understands that strategy has moved beyond generals. It lives here now, in factories, in schedules, in numbers that do not care about courage. December 1944, Camp for Captured Officers, United States. Winter settles over the camp with an orderliness that still feels foreign to Erich Müller. Snow arrives. Roads are cleared. Heating works without interruption. Meals arrive on time. Everything functions as scheduled. But it is not the comfort that troubles him. It is the contrast. In the evenings, German officers gather in small groups, speaking in low voices, the way men do when they know something they cannot undo. The talk is no longer about tactics or miracle weapons. It is about factories, rail lines, skilled labor, numbers. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Albrecht, formerly of an armored corps staff, spreads a crude map across the table one night. He marks it with the blunt end of a pencil. "Here," he says, "Kassel, bombed again in October, production halved." He moves the pencil. "Magdeburg, assembly disrupted, rail yards destroyed." Another mark. "Nuremberg, bearings shortage." Müller listens, silent. Albrecht looks up. "Even if the Führer ordered 10,000 tanks tomorrow," he says, "we could not build them." The words hang in the air. Germany's armored doctrine had been built on excellence, superior design, superior optics, superior crews. A smaller force, wielded perfectly, defeating larger enemies through maneuver and shock. It had worked once. But that doctrine assumed something critical, that losses would be temporary. By late 1944, nothing is temporary anymore. A Panther tank destroyed outside Caen takes months to replace, if the factory still exists. The engine might arrive without transmissions, the hull without optics, the optics without trained crews to use them. Meanwhile, American Shermans arrive whole, by the thousands. Müller remembers standing on that factory railing, watching turrets drop into place like pieces of a puzzle that always fit. No improvisation, no desperate substitutions, just flow. One evening, an American officer overseeing the POW program sits down with the Germans over coffee. The conversation is polite, almost academic. "You had good tanks," the officer says, not unkindly. "Better guns, better armor." Müller nods. "We needed them to be." The American considers this "we didn't." That single sentence explains everything. The Sherman was never meant to be invincible. It was meant to be available. When it burned, another arrived. When a crew was lost, another had already finished training. When a unit was depleted, replacements did not require miracles, just time. And time, Müller now sees, belongs entirely to the United States. Back home, Germany has none left. The Ardennes offensive, what the Germans call the Wacht am Rhein, becomes the final proof. News reaches the camp slowly, filtered through newspapers and guarded conversations. Initial success. Surprise. American units pushed back. Then the line stiffens. Fuel runs out. The tanks stop. Müller reads the reports again and again. Panthers abandoned intact for lack of gasoline. Crews destroying their own machines. Units immobilized not by enemy fire, but by logistics. America counters with reserves. Always reserves. New divisions. New tanks. New aircraft. Arriving not weeks later, but days. The offensive collapses under its own weight. In the camp, no one celebrates. No one mourns. The German officers simply acknowledge what they already knew. The war has moved beyond the battlefield. It is now a contest of endurance, and Germany is exhausted. Müller begins to understand why the Americans allowed them to see the factories. It was not cruelty. It was not propaganda. It was education, a lesson in inevitability. You cannot outfight an enemy who replaces entire divisions while you count surviving vehicles on one hand. You cannot win a war where each loss is permanent and the enemy's losses are temporary inconveniences. Excellence without replacement is fragility. As December deepens, Müller stops drawing battle maps. He draws flow charts instead. Production curves, supply timelines, shipping capacity, training pipelines. The curves do not intersect. Germany's line slopes downward. America's climbs steadily upward, unbroken. And in that quiet, heated barracks, surrounded by men who once planned armored breakthroughs, Müller finally accepts the truth that no speech in Berlin ever admitted. The war was lost not when tanks met tanks, but when factories met factories. January-February 1945, United States. The realization does not arrive with drama. There is no single headline, no announcement, no emotional collapse. It comes the way cold seeps into concrete, slowly, inevitably, until one day you notice that everything has changed. For Hauptmann Erich Müller, it happens during another visit. This time, not to a tank plant, but to a rail yard. They arrive just after dawn. Frost clings to the rails. Switch engines idle quietly, steam rising in soft plumes. Rows of flat cars stretch farther than Müller can see, each loaded with armored vehicles, wrapped in tarps, secured with chains, tagged and logged. An American transportation officer walks them along the platform. "Armor shipment heading east," he says. "Port by tomorrow night." Müller stops walking. "Tomorrow?" he asks. The officer nods. "Yeah. Timing's tight, but we've got priority clearance." Priority. Müller stares at the rail cars. In Germany, rail schedules exist mostly on paper now. Tracks are cratered, bridges destroyed. Trains sit idle, waiting for fuel, crews, or routes that no longer exist. Here, the problem is not whether tanks will move. It is how fast. They watch a locomotive pull forward, coupling cleanly, the sound sharp and confident. Another train waits on a parallel track, and another beyond it. "How many of these a day?" Müller asks quietly. The officer does not need to check. "Depends. Dozens. Dozens of trains, each carrying dozens of tanks, each train running on time." Later that week, Müller is allowed access to a camp library. He finds technical journals, trade publications, even pre-war economic studies. No censorship. No hiding. He reads about American steel output, oil refining, synthetic rubber replacement programs, training pipelines, pilot hours, tank crew rotations. It is all there. Nothing secret, nothing improvised. America did not stumble into this. It planned it. Germany, by contrast, had gambled everything on speed, on short wars, on shock, on the belief that enemies would collapse before endurance mattered. That belief had shaped everything. Production schedules, training programs, even weapon design. Panthers and Tigers were masterpieces, and masterpieces are slow, expensive, difficult to replace. Müller writes in his notebook late one night, the pencil pressing hard into the paper. "We optimized for the first year. They optimized for the fifth." He thinks of young German tank crews sent into combat with minimal training, climbing into machines too complex to maintain under fire. He thinks of spare parts cannibalized from wrecks, of factories rebuilding sections of roofs faster than they can rebuild supply chains. And he thinks of the American Sherman, imperfect, undergunned by comparison, mocked endlessly by German crews early in the war, yet always there, always replaced, always backed by fuel, ammunition, radios, maintenance, recovery vehicles, and fresh men. Müller understands now that the Americans did not need their tanks to survive battles. They needed them to survive the war. One afternoon, a younger German officer voices the thought aloud. "So what would have happened," he asks bitterly, "if our tanks had been built like theirs?" Müller answers without hesitation. "We would have lost earlier," he says. The room falls silent. He explains carefully. Germany could never have matched American output. Not with its resources, not under bombing, not while fighting on multiple fronts. The attempt to chase perfection had been a necessity born of weakness, not superiority. America did not chase perfection. It chased sufficiency at scale. That is the difference. By February 1945, the conversations among German officers no longer revolve around how to win. They revolve around how long until the end. The Ardennes has failed. The Eastern Front is collapsing. The air belongs entirely to the Allies. Tanks roll forward unopposed, not because they are unbeatable, but because there are always more. Müller stops thinking like an officer. He starts thinking like an accountant, and the books do not balance. March-April 1945, United States. Spring comes early in the Midwest. Snow melts into mud, then dries into dust. Trains run more frequently, not less. Factory whistles still mark shifts with mechanical regularity. The war in Europe is nearing its end, but nothing here slows down. For Hauptmann Erich Müller, this is the final, cruel confirmation. If American production were driven by desperation, it would ease as victory approached. If it were fueled by fear, it would spike and then collapse. Instead, it remains steady, unemotional, almost indifferent. One afternoon, Müller is seated with several other German officers in a briefing room, not for propaganda, but for what the Americans call orientation. An army major outlines post-war redeployment plans using a chalkboard. "European operations wind down," the major explains. "Pacific demand increases. Armor and vehicles will be redirected accordingly." Redirected. Müller feels a dull pressure behind his eyes. Germany cannot redirect anything anymore. Germany scrapes. A fellow officer, once a logistics planner on the Eastern Front, leans over and whispers, "They're talking about tanks the way we talked about ammunition." Müller nods. In Germany, strategy once meant terrain, maneuver, surprise. In America, strategy means throughput. Later, during another controlled tour, this time of a vehicle depot, Müller walks past endless rows of Shermans parked nose to tail. Some are fresh from factories. Others returned from training units. A few show lightware, already scheduled for refurbishment. None are abandoned. None are cannibalized. Each has a future assigned to it. An American sergeant supervising the yard speaks without pride. "We keep enough on hand so units don't wait," he says. "Waiting costs lives." Waiting. Müller remembers waiting for spare parts outside Kursk. Waiting for fuel in Normandy. Waiting for orders that could not be executed because resources never arrived. Waiting had been fatal. Here, it is engineered out of the system. News from Europe arrives daily now. Rhine crossings, encirclements, entire German formations surrendering intact because they cannot move or resupply. Tanks ditched, bridges blown behind retreating units that have nowhere left to retreat to. Müller recognizes the pattern instantly. This is not collapse from defeat in battle. This is collapse from exhaustion. Arithmetic exhaustion. One evening, Müller and Albrecht sit quietly as an American radio plays in the background. A broadcaster mentions that tank production goals for April have been exceeded. "Exceeded," Albrecht laughs once, a short, dry sound with no humor in it. "Do you realize," he says, that even if every Sherman were destroyed the moment it arrived in Europe, they would still outpace our ability to kill them. Müller answers softly, yes. That is the moment strategy finally dies. There is no maneuver that defeats a river of steel, no counterattack that empties a pipeline faster than it refills, no doctrine that compensates for negative replacement rates. German armored doctrine had been brilliant, flexible, terrifying. It had also been fragile. The Americans built something duller and unstoppable. By April, Müller no longer feels bitterness, only a strange calm, like a man who has finished arguing with the weather. He begins to see the war not as a tragedy of mistakes, but as a collision between two different understandings of modern conflict. Germany believed war was decided by decisive moments. America believed war was decided by sustained processes. Only one belief surveys industrialization. As Allied forces cross into central Germany, Müller knows the end is no longer a question of if, but when. The factories he saw will not stop. The trains will not pause. The depots will not empty. The Shermans will keep coming, not because they are needed immediately, but because the system does not know how to do anything else. It produces. And that, Müller finally understands, is why German officers were allowed to see those numbers in 1944, not to humiliate them, but to show them the future, a future where courage matters less than capacity, where tactics bow to logistics, where the side that can build thousands of tanks a month does not need to gamble on miracles. It simply waits, and waiting, when backed by arithmetic, becomes victory. May 1945. United States, Germany. The end arrives as Müller had come to expect without drama. There is no sudden silence in the camp. No cheers from the guards. Just a notice posted. Radios murmuring more often. Conversations stopping mid-sentence because everyone already knows what the words will be. Germany has surrendered. For the first time since 1939, the arithmetic no longer needs to be updated. Hauptmann Erich Müller sits alone on his bunk, hands folded, staring at a wall he no longer sees. Somewhere across the ocean, a country lies in ruins. Cities flattened, rail lines twisted, factories burned out shells of what they once were. The war has not merely been lost, it has been consumed. In the days that follow, American routines continue unchanged. Meals arrive on schedule, trains run on time, vehicles are serviced, armor units rotate home while others prepare for redeployment. The factories do not stop. That, more than the surrender itself, stays with Müller. Victory has not altered the system, it has validated it. During one final conversation, an American officer, a colonel this time, speaks candidly to the German prisoners. "We didn't know how long the war would last," he says, "so we built like it might last forever." Müller understands the implication immediately. Germany built for the war it wanted. America built for the war it might have. That difference decided everything. In the months ahead, Müller will return to a homeland that must relearn scarcity from the ground up. He will walk through towns where nothing moves on schedule, where replacement is a hope, not a guarantee, where planning begins again at zero. But the lesson will remain clear. The Sherman was never meant to terrify. It was meant to arrive, and arrive again, and again, by the thousands. German officers had been stunned, not because America built better tanks, but because it built more tanks than the concept of shortage could survive. In the end, no battlefield brilliance could compete with uninterrupted production. No heroic stand could erase a monthly output that exceeded an entire nation's capacity to respond. The war did not end when armies met. It ended when factories did, and by the time German officers stood on American rail platforms in 1944, watching armored trains roll past without end, the outcome was already sealed, not by fate, not by luck, but by a simple truth of modern war. The side that can replace everything eventually loses nothing that matters.